So today we're diving into the brilliant, really complex, and honestly super consequential life of John Henry Newman. He was one of the most significant religious figures of the 19th century, and his story, well, it's an incredible journey of conviction, controversy, and a surprising quest for unity.
And that brings us to the central paradox we're exploring today. Think about it. Can an act of division actually inspire unity? You see, Newman was this celebrated leader in the Anglican Church, who then, famously, converted to Catholicism. On the surface, that looks like the ultimate act of division, right? So how on earth could a man who left one church for another become a model for Christian unity, a movement we call ecumenism that's all about bringing churches together? Let's unpack that. So to really get this paradox, you got to understand the man himself. Back in the early 1800s, John Henry Newman wasn't just some Anglican priest. He was a total star at Oxford, a leading voice in the Church of England. His influence both intellectually and spiritually was just immense, which is exactly why his eventual decision was so utterly shocking to everyone.
Okay, let's just be real for a second about how this looked from the outside. When a major leader leaves their community for what's seen as a rival one, it looks like he's building a wall, not a bridge. It really seems like the very definition of division, a clear rejection of his former faith, which is, the exact opposite of bringing churches together.
To figure out why he made this massive leap, we actually have to rewind all the way back to the beginning and look at what Newman believed about the church long before he ever thought about leaving it. His entire journey, you'll see, was guided by just a few core principles about what he thought the Church of God was truly meant to be.
And check this out. As early as 1825, way before his crisis of faith, Newman was already rock solid on this. He argued, really passionately, that the church wasn't just some vague, invisible club for believers. No, for him, it absolutely had to be a real, tangible, physical institution, something you could actually see and touch.
So you can really boil his whole view down to these three crucial pillars. First, the church is visible. It's an institution, not just an idea. Second, it's sacramental, meaning God's grace isn't just floating around, it flows through physical things, like baptism and communion. And third, it had to be apostolic. There had to be an unbroken historical chain linking it directly back to Jesus' original apostles. For Newman, these three things were his absolute non-negotiables. Okay, so you've got these core beliefs, but, and this is a huge but, they create this massive theological problem for him. If the church has to be visible, sacramental, and apostolic, who actually fits that bill? For him, as a loyal Anglican, there was one giant obstacle that got in the way of his whole worldview: the Church of Rome. So what was Newman's solution? Well, he championed this idea called the via media, which just means the middle way. He truly believed the Church of England was the perfect, balanced path. He saw two extremes. On one side, you had the Roman extreme, which he thought was corrupt, political, even idolatrous. And on the other, you had the Protestant extreme, which he felt was too disconnected from history, too wishy-washy. In his mind, the Anglican Church was the true apostolic church, sitting right there in the perfect middle.
And if you think that sounds a little strong, just get a load of this quote from 1833. This isn't just some mild disagreement. This is basically a declaration of war. He saw the Roman Catholic Church as a force that had to be destroyed. It's just wild to read that, knowing where he ends up. It makes his eventual journey an almost unimaginable leap, intellectually and spiritually.
So you have to ask yourself, what on earth could possibly change the mind of a man who is this certain? Well, the answer, believe it or not, was history. Newman decided to do a deep, scholarly dive into the conflicts of the early Christian church, and that decision would become the absolute turning point of his entire life. I mean, imagine this. What happens when the very thing you're studying to prove your point ends up completely undermining it? That's the question that drove his whole crisis. As a man of deep intellectual honesty, Newman started reading the early church fathers, fully expecting his research to prove that the Anglican middle way was the right way. But instead, what he found threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew. And you can see from this timeline, this wasn't some snap decision, no way. This was a slow burn, a 20-year journey. He starts with his core principles of a visible church, then he fiercely defends his Anglican position, and then comes the key moment, in 1835, when his study of an ancient heresy called Arianism changed the entire game. And this is where he has this absolutely devastating realization. While he's studying this Arian controversy from way back in the 4th century, Newman was horrified to discover that the arguments his own Anglican Church was using against Rome sounded eerily, uncomfortably similar to the arguments ancient heretics had used against the Orthodox Church of their day. The result was that his entire worldview got flipped on its head. Rome, which he once saw as the corrupt extreme, suddenly looked consistent with the early church, and his own beloved Anglican Church, he now saw it as being semi-Arian, dangerously close to heresy. The ground had completely shifted beneath his feet.
So, after this intellectual earthquake, what do you do? Well, it led him to the single hardest decision of his life. And you have to understand, for him, this wasn't betrayal. It was the opposite. It was finally truly fulfilling those principles he'd held his entire life about finding the one, true, visible, and apostolic church.
And the one engine driving this whole train was this powerful idea of conscience. For Newman, conscience wasn't just, a gut feeling. It was a sacred duty, a deeply personal command from God to follow the truth, no matter the cost, no matter how much it hurt, and no matter what you had to give up.
And so it all comes to a head in 1845. After years of intense study, prayer, and agonizing, he took the final step. He left his prestigious position at Oxford, his leadership in the Church of England, and followed his conscience right into the Catholic Church.
But here's what's so important to understand. He never just threw his past away. He didn't see it as a total rejection. In fact, he always kept a deep respect for the Church of England, even calling her the mother who has given me the faith. He saw his Anglican years not as a mistake, but as a necessary providential step on his journey toward what he now believed was the fullness of truth.
So let's go back to that question for the beginning. How can an act of division possibly inspire unity? Well, Newman's life gives us a pretty profound answer. The bridge across even the deepest divides isn't built on just compromising. For him, it's built on conscience. It's a bridge held up by an honest, personal, intellectually rigorous search for the truth. His legacy for us today is that genuine unity really begins when we respect that sincere, conscientious journey in other people, even if it leads them down a totally different path.
And that really leaves us with a final thought, a question for all of us today. In a world that so often demands that we just pick a side and stick to it, Newman's difficult, intellectually honest journey is a real challenge. Are we more committed to our group, our tribe, or to the truth itself? And maybe more importantly, how willing are we to follow that truth, no matter where it leads?